Question 1. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a new decentralized finance (DeFi) platform is being considered for integration into the broader financial ecosystem. Which of the following approaches best reflects a comprehensive and responsible regulatory assessment of this emerging technology? Option A. Rely exclusively on existing regulatory frameworks designed for traditional financial institutions, assuming similar risk profiles and mitigation needs. Option B. Accept the platform's self-assessment of risks and compliance without independent verification or further investigation. Option C. Conduct a thorough analysis of the platform's underlying technology, potential market impact, operational vulnerabilities, and systemic risks, engaging with industry experts and seeking diverse data inputs. Option D. Immediately ban the platform due to its novel nature and the perceived difficulty in applying current regulations. Correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough analysis of the platform's underlying technology, potential market impact, operational vulnerabilities, and systemic risks, engaging with industry experts and seeking diverse data inputs. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the assessment of a new technology's potential impact on financial stability and market integrity. The challenge lies in the inherent uncertainty of emerging technologies, the potential for unforeseen risks, and the need to balance innovation with robust risk management. Regulators must exercise careful judgment to avoid stifling beneficial technological advancements while ensuring systemic risks are adequately identified and mitigated. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of proactive and comprehensive risk assessment mandated by regulatory frameworks designed to ensure financial stability. This approach involves a systematic evaluation of the technology's operational, market, credit, and liquidity risks, considering its potential impact on existing financial infrastructure and consumer protection. It emphasizes collaboration with industry stakeholders to gather diverse perspectives and data, fostering a more informed and effective regulatory response. This aligns with the ethical duty of regulators to safeguard the financial system and its participants. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely relying on historical data and established risk models. This fails to account for the novel nature of emerging technologies, which may exhibit risk profiles not captured by past experiences. This can lead to underestimation of potential risks and a failure to implement appropriate safeguards, violating the regulatory duty to address emerging threats. Another incorrect approach is to immediately prohibit the technology without a thorough assessment. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an unwillingness to engage with innovation, potentially hindering beneficial market developments and failing to meet the regulatory objective of fostering a dynamic and competitive financial landscape. It also bypasses the established processes for risk evaluation and mitigation. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the entire risk assessment to the technology developers without independent oversight. This creates a significant conflict of interest and undermines the regulator's responsibility to provide impartial oversight. It fails to uphold the ethical obligation of independent judgment and can lead to the overlooking of critical risks that may not be in the developer's best interest to disclose. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, evidence-based approach to risk assessment. This involves defining the scope of the assessment, identifying potential risks across various categories, evaluating the likelihood and impact of these risks, and developing appropriate mitigation strategies. Continuous monitoring and adaptation are crucial, especially with emerging technologies. Collaboration, transparency, and a commitment to both innovation and stability are key tenets of effective regulatory practice. Question 2. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new cloud-based data analytics platform offers significant potential for cost reduction and enhanced reporting capabilities. However, the platform's security architecture is less mature than the current on-premises solution, and there are known, albeit infrequent, instances of data breaches reported by other users of similar cloud services. What is the most prudent next step in the risk assessment process? Option A. Prioritize the enhanced reporting capabilities and cost savings, and defer any detailed security risk assessment until after the platform has been in use for a significant period. Option B. Conduct a detailed security audit of the proposed cloud platform, focusing on its data encryption, access controls, and incident response capabilities, and develop specific mitigation strategies for identified vulnerabilities before proceeding with implementation. Option C. Rely on the vendor's assurances of security and the general reputation of cloud services for data protection, and proceed with implementation without further in-depth security review. Option D. Proceed with the implementation of the new platform to realize the cost savings, and plan to address any security issues that may arise after deployment. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed security audit of the proposed cloud platform, focusing on its data encryption, access controls, and incident response capabilities, and develop specific mitigation strategies for identified vulnerabilities before proceeding with implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the potential benefits of a new technology against its inherent risks, all within the strict confines of the Oracle Hiring Assessment Tests regulatory framework. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing and mitigating risks without succumbing to overconfidence or underestimation, which could lead to significant financial or reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the decision-making process is robust, evidence-based, and compliant with the implicit guidelines of professional assessment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive and systematic evaluation of all potential risks and benefits. This aligns with the principles of sound risk management, which are fundamental in any professional setting, especially within technology-driven environments. By thoroughly documenting the risk assessment process, identifying mitigation strategies, and establishing clear monitoring mechanisms, professionals demonstrate due diligence and a commitment to responsible innovation. This proactive stance helps prevent unforeseen issues and ensures that decisions are made with a clear understanding of potential downsides, thereby safeguarding the organization's interests and adhering to ethical standards of care. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential cost savings without adequately considering the security vulnerabilities of the new system represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This failure stems from a disregard for the principle of proportionality in risk management, where the potential benefits must be weighed against the potential harms. Ethically, it breaches the duty of care owed to the organization and its stakeholders by exposing them to undue risk. From a regulatory perspective, it could violate implicit or explicit guidelines that mandate robust security protocols and data protection measures, especially if the new system handles sensitive information. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or the perceived popularity of a technology, rather than a structured risk assessment, is also professionally unacceptable. This approach lacks objectivity and rigor, failing to meet the standards of evidence-based decision-making. Ethically, it can lead to biased judgments and the adoption of solutions that are not fit for purpose, potentially causing harm. Regulatory failure occurs because it bypasses established procedures for evaluating and approving new technologies, which often include specific requirements for risk assessment and compliance checks. A third incorrect approach that involves implementing the technology immediately and addressing risks reactively demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of risk management principles. This reactive stance is inherently more costly and damaging than a proactive one. Ethically, it shows a lack of foresight and responsibility, potentially leading to breaches of trust and security. Regulatory failure is evident, as it likely contravenes requirements for pre-implementation risk assessments and compliance reviews, exposing the organization to penalties and legal repercussions. The professional decision-making process for similar situation should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This typically includes identifying potential risks, analyzing their likelihood and impact, evaluating existing controls, determining the residual risk, and developing mitigation strategies. This process should be iterative and involve input from relevant stakeholders. Professionals should always document their findings and decisions, ensuring transparency and accountability. Furthermore, they must remain aware of the evolving regulatory landscape and industry best practices to ensure continuous compliance and effective risk management. Question 3. Consider a scenario where a client approaches you, an advisor registered under the Oracle Hiring Assessment Test Framework, seeking to minimize their tax liability for the upcoming fiscal year. The client suggests a complex financial arrangement that they believe will significantly reduce their taxable income, but they have not provided detailed documentation or specific legal citations to support its validity. They express urgency and a desire for a quick implementation. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Proceed with the client's proposed arrangement, but only after obtaining a written indemnity from the client against any future penalties or legal consequences. Option B. Advise the client that no tax planning is possible beyond standard deductions and allowances, as any complex strategy carries too much risk. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the client's financial situation and the proposed arrangement, researching relevant tax laws and guidance to determine its legality and compliance before offering any advice. Option D. Immediately implement the client's suggested arrangement, relying on their assurance that it is legally sound to meet their demand for urgency. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the client's financial situation and the proposed arrangement, researching relevant tax laws and guidance to determine its legality and compliance before offering any advice. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for immediate, potentially aggressive, tax avoidance strategies and the advisor's obligation to ensure compliance with tax laws and ethical standards. The advisor must navigate the fine line between legitimate tax planning and aggressive tax evasion, which carries significant legal and reputational risks for both the client and the advisor. Careful judgment is required to identify and recommend strategies that are both effective and legally sound. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation and objectives, coupled with a comprehensive review of applicable tax legislation and guidance. This ensures that any recommended strategies are not only compliant with the Oracle Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework, but also ethically sound and sustainable. It demonstrates a commitment to providing advice that protects the client from future penalties and legal repercussions, thereby fostering a relationship built on trust and integrity. Adhering to professional codes of conduct, which emphasize diligence, competence, and integrity, is paramount. An incorrect approach that involves implementing a strategy based solely on the client's verbal assurance of legality, without independent verification, fails to meet the standard of professional due diligence. This could lead to a violation of tax laws, resulting in penalties, interest, and potential criminal charges for the client, and professional misconduct for the advisor. Another incorrect approach, which involves outright refusal to engage in any tax planning, even legitimate strategies, might be seen as a failure to provide competent advice and meet the client's reasonable expectations within legal boundaries. A third incorrect approach, which involves recommending a strategy that is known to be aggressive and has been challenged by tax authorities without full disclosure of the risks, constitutes a serious ethical and regulatory breach, potentially exposing the client to significant financial and legal jeopardy. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the client's needs and objectives. This should be followed by a rigorous assessment of the legal and regulatory landscape, including relevant statutes, case law, and guidance from tax authorities. Any proposed strategy must be evaluated for its compliance, economic substance, and potential risks. Open and transparent communication with the client regarding the benefits, risks, and uncertainties of any proposed strategy is crucial. If a strategy pushes the boundaries of acceptable practice, the advisor must ensure the client is fully informed and makes an informed decision, while also considering their own professional and ethical boundaries. Question 4. The investigation demonstrates that a financial advisory firm is transitioning to a new, automated client onboarding platform designed to streamline operations. However, concerns have been raised regarding the platform's ability to fully comply with all mandatory client identification and verification protocols as stipulated by the relevant regulatory bodies, particularly in edge cases involving complex ownership structures or international clients. The firm's management is considering how to best introduce this new system to ensure both operational efficiency and unwavering regulatory adherence. Option A. Deploy the new platform solely for new clients, while continuing to use the legacy system for existing clients, deferring any integration or comprehensive review of the new system's compliance capabilities. Option B. Prioritize speed of onboarding by disabling certain optional verification steps within the new platform, relying on the assumption that most clients will be low risk. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive pilot program with a limited group of advisors and clients to test the platform's functionality, identify potential compliance issues, and refine the process before a full-scale rollout. Option D. Implement the new onboarding platform across all client segments immediately, with a plan to address any identified compliance gaps retrospectively through post-implementation audits. The correct answer is D. Implement the new onboarding platform across all client segments immediately, with a plan to address any identified compliance gaps retrospectively through post-implementation audits. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where a financial advisor, operating under the Oracle Hiring Assessment Tests regulatory framework, assumed to be a hypothetical framework for this exam, focusing on principles akin to those found in regulated financial advice environments, is tasked with implementing a new client onboarding process. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficiency and speed with the absolute requirement for thoroughness and compliance with all applicable regulations, particularly those concerning Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) procedures. This requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment, data privacy, and the potential for regulatory scrutiny. The correct approach involves a phased implementation of the new onboarding system, starting with a pilot program involving a select group of clients and advisors. This allows for real-world testing of the system's functionality, identification of any unforeseen technical glitches or procedural gaps, and a controlled environment to assess compliance with all regulatory mandates. This approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes risk mitigation and ensures that any issues are identified and resolved before a full-scale rollout, thereby safeguarding client data, maintaining regulatory adherence, and preventing potential financial or reputational damage. It aligns with the ethical duty of care owed to clients and the professional obligation to uphold regulatory standards. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deploy the new system across all clients and advisors without adequate testing. This poses significant regulatory and ethical failures. Specifically, it risks non-compliance with KYC/AML regulations if the system fails to capture or verify necessary client information accurately, leading to potential penalties and sanctions. It also breaches data privacy principles if client data is mishandled or exposed due to system vulnerabilities. Another incorrect approach would be to bypass certain verification steps in the new system to expedite onboarding, even if the system is technically functional. This directly contravenes regulatory requirements for due diligence and carries a high risk of facilitating illicit activities, resulting in severe legal and ethical repercussions. A third incorrect approach might be to rely solely on automated checks without human oversight, assuming the technology is infallible. This fails to account for the complexities and nuances that often require human judgment in assessing risk and verifying information, potentially leading to regulatory breaches and a failure to identify suspicious activities. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment of the proposed change, a thorough review of all relevant regulatory requirements, and the development of a phased implementation plan with clear testing and validation protocols. Professionals must prioritize compliance and client protection, even if it means a slower rollout. This involves seeking expert advice, conducting internal audits, and establishing feedback mechanisms to continuously monitor and improve processes. Question 5. Upon reviewing the latest internal performance metrics for a newly launched software product, a project manager notices that while user adoption rates are exceeding initial projections, customer satisfaction scores are significantly lower than anticipated due to a persistent, albeit minor, bug. The marketing department is preparing a press release to highlight the product's success and is requesting the project manager's input on the data to be included. The project manager is aware that emphasizing only the high adoption rates without mentioning the satisfaction issues could create a misleadingly positive public image. Option A. Suggest to the marketing department that they emphasize the user adoption rates and subtly imply that the product is performing exceptionally well across all metrics, without explicitly mentioning satisfaction scores. Option B. Provide the marketing department with a comprehensive overview of both user adoption rates and customer satisfaction scores, clearly explaining the context of the lower satisfaction, including the nature of the bug and the ongoing efforts to resolve it. Option C. Advise the marketing department to delay the press release until the bug is completely resolved and customer satisfaction scores have improved, even if this means missing a planned announcement window. Option D. Focus solely on the impressive user adoption rates in the information provided to the marketing department, as this is the most positive and attention-grabbing metric. The correct answer is B. Provide the marketing department with a comprehensive overview of both user adoption rates and customer satisfaction scores, clearly explaining the context of the lower satisfaction, including the nature of the bug and the ongoing efforts to resolve it. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for positive public perception and the ethical obligation to disclose potentially negative information accurately and transparently. The pressure to manage public relations can lead individuals to consider actions that might compromise integrity. Careful judgment is required to navigate this tension while upholding professional standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes factual accuracy and transparency, which are foundational ethical principles in professional conduct. Adhering to these principles ensures that stakeholders receive reliable information, fostering trust and accountability. This aligns with the broader ethical expectation that professionals act with honesty and integrity, avoiding misleading statements or omissions that could deceive others. An incorrect approach that involves selectively highlighting positive aspects while downplaying or omitting negative ones constitutes a failure of transparency and honesty. This can mislead stakeholders about the true performance or risks associated with a product or service, potentially violating ethical guidelines that prohibit deceptive practices. Another incorrect approach, which involves fabricating positive data to create a more favorable impression, is a severe ethical breach involving dishonesty and misrepresentation. This not only violates professional integrity, but could also have legal ramifications if it leads to financial harm for investors or consumers. A third incorrect approach, which is to remain silent and avoid any communication, can be problematic if there is a clear expectation or duty to inform stakeholders about material developments. This inaction can be interpreted as an attempt to conceal information or a lack of responsibility, potentially damaging reputation and trust. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core ethical principles at play, such as honesty, integrity, and transparency. They should then assess the potential impact of different courses of action on all stakeholders, consulting relevant company policies, professional codes of conduct, and if necessary, seeking advice from legal counsel or ethics committees can provide further guidance. The ultimate decision should be one that upholds the highest ethical standards and promotes long-term trust and credibility. Question 6. The performance metrics show a significant deviation from the projected returns for a key client portfolio. While there's an opportunity to adjust the reporting methodology slightly to bring the figures closer to the projection, this adjustment would not reflect the true underlying performance and could mislead the client about the investment's actual progress. Option A. Report the performance metrics accurately as they are, even if they fall short of projections, and proactively communicate the reasons for the deviation to the client. Option B. Focus solely on future strategies to recover the projected returns without addressing the current reporting discrepancy with the client. Option C. Adjust the reporting methodology to align the metrics with the projected returns, thereby presenting a more favorable, albeit inaccurate, picture to the client. Option D. Delay reporting the performance metrics until further analysis can be conducted, hoping that the situation might improve or a more favorable narrative can be constructed. The correct answer is A. Report the performance metrics accurately as they are, even if they fall short of projections, and proactively communicate the reasons for the deviation to the client. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the conflict between achieving performance targets and maintaining ethical integrity, particularly concerning data accuracy and client trust. The pressure to meet metrics can tempt individuals to misrepresent information, which can have severe consequences for clients, the firm, and the individual's career. Careful judgment is required to navigate this pressure and uphold professional standards. The correct approach involves a commitment to data integrity and transparent communication. By accurately reporting the performance metrics, even if they are below expectations, the professional demonstrates honesty and builds long-term trust with clients and stakeholders. This aligns with the ethical principles of transparency and accountability, which are fundamental in financial services. It also adheres to regulatory expectations that demand truthful reporting of financial data. An incorrect approach of manipulating data to meet targets represents a serious ethical and regulatory failure. This action constitutes misrepresentation, which can mislead clients about their investment performance and potentially lead to poor financial decisions on their part. Such behavior violates principles of fairness and honesty, and it directly contravenes regulations that prohibit fraudulent or deceptive practices. Furthermore, it undermines the credibility of the firm and can result in severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the discrepancy and hoping it resolves itself is also professionally unacceptable. This inaction allows a potentially misleading situation to persist, which is a form of passive deception. It fails to address the root cause of the underperformance or the data anomaly, thereby not serving the client's best interests. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the ethical dilemma. Recognize the conflict between performance targets and data accuracy. 2. Gather facts. Understand the exact nature of the performance metrics and the reasons for any discrepancies. 3. Consult relevant policies and regulations. Review internal guidelines and external regulatory requirements regarding data reporting and client communication. 4. Seek guidance. If unsure, consult with a supervisor or compliance department. 5. Act with integrity. Prioritize honesty, transparency, and the client's best interests above short-term performance pressures. 6. Document actions. Keep records of all communications and decisions made. Question 7. Examination of the data shows that the current order processing workflow is experiencing significant delays, impacting customer satisfaction and internal efficiency. A proposed solution involves automating several manual steps. To address this, which of the following implementation strategies would best balance rapid deployment with risk mitigation and optimal process improvement? Option A. Focus exclusively on the technical aspects of the automation, ensuring the code is efficient, and defer user training and workflow impact assessments until after the system is live. Option B. Conduct a pilot program of the automation in a controlled, isolated environment, gather extensive user feedback, and then iteratively roll out the changes to broader systems based on performance data and validated improvements. Option C. Implement the automation changes across all order processing systems concurrently, with minimal pre-launch testing to achieve immediate efficiency gains. Option D. Deploy the automation only to a single, non-essential department to test its functionality, without a defined plan for scaling or incorporating feedback into wider organizational changes. The correct answer is C. Implement the automation changes across all order processing systems concurrently, with minimal pre-launch testing, to achieve immediate efficiency gains. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing efficiency gains with potential impacts on data integrity and user experience, which are critical for regulatory compliance and operational effectiveness. The pressure to implement changes quickly without thorough validation can lead to unintended consequences that violate data handling standards or disrupt critical business processes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a phased rollout with robust testing and feedback mechanisms. This aligns with best practices in process optimization by ensuring that changes are validated in a controlled environment before full deployment. It minimizes the risk of widespread disruption and allows for iterative refinement based on real-world performance and user input. From a regulatory perspective, this methodical approach helps maintain data accuracy and system reliability, which are often subject to audit and compliance requirements. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible implementation and risk management. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing the changes across all systems simultaneously without prior testing or user feedback poses a significant risk. This approach disregards the potential for unforeseen bugs or incompatibilities that could compromise data integrity or system functionality. Such a failure could lead to breaches of data protection regulations or operational failures that have financial and reputational consequences. Rolling out the changes only to a small, non-critical department without a clear plan for broader adoption or feedback collection is insufficient. While it limits immediate risk, it fails to achieve the intended process optimization benefits across the organization and misses an opportunity to gather valuable insights for a wider rollout. This can be seen as a missed opportunity for proactive risk mitigation and strategic implementation. Focusing solely on the technical implementation without considering the impact on end users and their workflows is a common pitfall. This can lead to resistance, decreased productivity, and errors in data entry or processing, ultimately undermining the intended optimization. It also fails to address the human element of change management, which is crucial for successful process adoption and compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured approach to process optimization, beginning with a clear understanding of objectives and potential risks. This involves thorough analysis, pilot testing, phased implementation, and continuous monitoring. Engaging stakeholders, including end users, throughout the process is essential for gathering feedback and ensuring successful adoption. A risk-based approach, prioritizing the most critical systems and data, is paramount. Professionals must always consider the regulatory implications of any process change, ensuring that data integrity, security, and compliance are maintained or enhanced. Question 8. Performance analysis shows that a key stakeholder is strongly advocating for a custom solution that bypasses several standard Oracle configuration best practices for a critical system module, citing perceived immediate efficiency gains. The project team has identified significant potential risks associated with this deviation, including future upgrade complexities and security vulnerabilities. What is the most professional and effective approach for the project lead to manage this situation? Option A. Immediately implement the stakeholders' requested custom solution to ensure their satisfaction and avoid potential conflict, assuming they have a valid business reason for their request. Option B. Schedule a meeting with the stakeholder to present a detailed analysis of the risks and benefits of both the proposed custom solution and the standard Oracle best practice, offering alternative configurations that might address their efficiency concerns while adhering to established guidelines. Option C. Escalate the stakeholders' request and the team's concerns to senior management immediately, requesting their intervention to decide on the path forward. Option D. Inform the stakeholder that their request cannot be accommodated as it deviates from Oracle's established best practices, and that the project will proceed with the standard configuration without further discussion. The correct answer is B. Schedule a meeting with the stakeholder to present a detailed analysis of the risks and benefits of both the proposed custom solution and the standard Oracle best practice, offering alternative configurations that might address their efficiency concerns while adhering to established guidelines. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a senior stakeholder, despite having a vested interest in a project's success, is advocating for a course of action that deviates from established Oracle best practices and potentially introduces significant risks. The challenge lies in balancing the need to maintain positive stakeholder relationships with the imperative to uphold professional integrity and adhere to the technical and procedural standards expected within the Oracle ecosystem. Ignoring the stakeholders' request could lead to friction, while complying could compromise project quality and security. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, data-driven, and transparent communication strategy. It prioritizes educating the stakeholder on the rationale behind Oracle's recommended practices, highlighting the risks associated with the proposed deviation, and offering alternative solutions that align with best practices while still addressing the stakeholders' underlying concerns. This approach upholds professional integrity by prioritizing sound technical judgment and risk mitigation. It aligns with the ethical obligation to provide competent advice and to act in the best interest of the project and the organization, as implicitly guided by Oracle's established methodologies and the principles of responsible technology deployment. This demonstrates a commitment to quality, security, and long-term system stability, which are core tenets of professional IT practice. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately dismiss the stakeholder's suggestion without thorough consideration or explanation. This can be perceived as unprofessional, dismissive, and lacking in collaborative spirit, potentially damaging the relationship and hindering future communication. It fails to acknowledge the stakeholder's perspective and may lead them to seek alternative, less informed advice. Another incorrect approach is to blindly implement the stakeholder's suggestion to appease them, despite knowing it deviates from best practices. This represents a significant ethical failure, as it prioritizes short-term relationship management over professional responsibility and technical soundness. It exposes the project and the organization to unnecessary risks, potentially leading to performance issues, security vulnerabilities, or increased maintenance costs, all of which are contrary to the principles of good IT governance and professional conduct. A third incorrect approach involves escalating the disagreement to higher management without first attempting to resolve it directly with the stakeholder through reasoned discussion and evidence. While escalation may be necessary in some situations, it should be a last resort after all reasonable attempts at direct resolution have been exhausted. Premature escalation can be seen as an inability to manage professional relationships and conflicts effectively. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that emphasizes understanding the stakeholders' underlying needs, clearly articulating the rationale behind recommended practices, quantifying risks, and exploring collaborative solutions. This involves active listening, clear and concise communication, and a commitment to evidence-based decision-making. When faced with conflicting perspectives, the process should involve 1. Understanding the why behind the stakeholder's request. 2. Clearly explaining the why behind the recommended practice. 3. Identifying and communicating potential risks and benefits of each approach. And 4. Collaboratively seeking a solution that balances stakeholder needs with professional and organizational imperatives. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates a strong desire for immediate access to newly generated performance metrics, even before they have undergone the full internal validation process. How should a professional in this situation proceed to balance stakeholder expectations with data integrity and compliance? Option A. Share the preliminary, unvalidated metrics immediately to satisfy the stakeholder's request, as their feedback emphasizes urgency. Option B. Politely decline to share any information until the validation process is fully complete, without offering further explanation or alternative timelines. Option C. Initiate the full internal validation process for the metrics and provide the stakeholder with an estimated timeline for when the verified data will be available, explaining the importance of the validation steps. Option D. Provide a generalized overview of performance trends without sharing specific, unvalidated metrics, stating that detailed data is still under review. The correct answer is C. Initiate the full internal validation process for the metrics and provide the stakeholder with an estimated timeline for when the verified data will be available, explaining the importance of the validation steps. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a stakeholder's desire for immediate, potentially unverified, information and the regulatory imperative to ensure data accuracy and compliance before dissemination. The pressure to respond quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise integrity. Careful judgment is required to balance stakeholder expectations with the need for due diligence and adherence to Oracle's internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks governing data handling and reporting. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes verification and adherence to established protocols. This aligns with best professional practice by ensuring that information shared with stakeholders is accurate, reliable, and compliant with Oracle's internal data governance policies and any applicable external regulations. This methodical approach mitigates the risk of misinformation, reputational damage, and potential regulatory penalties. It demonstrates a commitment to data integrity, a cornerstone of professional conduct in any organization, especially one dealing with sensitive information. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately sharing the preliminary data without verification. This fails to uphold the principle of data accuracy and could lead to the dissemination of misleading information. It bypasses essential quality control steps, potentially violating internal data validation policies and any regulatory requirements that mandate accurate reporting. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the stakeholder's request outright, without offering an alternative or explanation. This demonstrates poor stakeholder management and a lack of proactive communication. While it avoids the risk of sharing inaccurate data, it fails to address the stakeholder's need for information and can damage relationships. It neglects the professional responsibility to engage constructively with stakeholders. A third incorrect approach is to provide a vague, non-committal response that offers no concrete information or timeline. This is a superficial attempt to placate the stakeholder without genuinely addressing their request or the underlying data integrity concerns. It lacks transparency and can breed distrust, as stakeholders may perceive it as an evasion rather than a responsible handling of information. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with such requests. This involves 1. Acknowledging the stakeholder's request promptly. 2. Assessing the nature and urgency of the information requested. 3. Identifying the internal processes and controls required to verify the data. 4. Communicating a realistic timeline for providing accurate information, explaining the necessity of the verification process. 5. If immediate preliminary information is permissible and can be clearly caveated, consider providing it with explicit disclaimers about its unverified status. 6. Escalating if the request poses a significant risk or requires input beyond one's authority. This framework ensures that stakeholder engagement is balanced with professional responsibility and regulatory compliance. Question 10. Analysis of a client's request to significantly alter their investment strategy based on recent market speculation, without a clear understanding of the long-term implications or the client's risk tolerance for such a drastic shift, requires a professional to navigate ethical obligations and regulatory guidelines. Which of the following represents the most appropriate decision-making framework in this situation? Option A. Politely decline the client's request, stating that the proposed strategy is too speculative and not in line with prudent financial management, without exploring the client's motivations or offering alternatives. Option B. Immediately implement the client's requested strategy to demonstrate responsiveness and client satisfaction, assuming the client has fully considered the risks involved. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's financial goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon, and then engage in a detailed discussion about the potential benefits and drawbacks of the requested strategy, offering alternative solutions that align with their overall financial plan and regulatory requirements. Option D. Advise the client on how to structure the requested strategy to bypass certain regulatory disclosure requirements, as long as the client explicitly agrees to the approach. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's financial goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon, and then engage in a detailed discussion about the potential benefits and drawbacks of the requested strategy, offering alternative solutions that align with their overall financial plan and regulatory requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated desires and the potential for those desires to lead to outcomes that are not in their best long-term interest, or that may even violate regulatory principles. The need for careful judgment arises from the responsibility to act in the client's best interest while adhering to ethical standards and regulatory requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's situation and objectives, coupled with an objective assessment of potential risks and benefits. This involves open communication, education, and a collaborative process to arrive at a solution that is both aligned with the client's goals and compliant with all applicable regulations. This aligns with the fundamental ethical duty of care and the regulatory expectation that professionals will act with integrity and competence. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's immediate request without further inquiry would fail to uphold the duty of care. It risks exposing the client to undue risk or suboptimal outcomes, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny or client dissatisfaction down the line. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying motivation or explore alternatives would demonstrate a lack of client centricity and could damage the professional relationship. It also fails to leverage the professional's expertise to guide the client towards a more robust solution. A third incorrect approach that attempts to find a loophole or circumvent established procedures, even if technically legal, would be ethically questionable and could expose both the client and the professional to significant reputational and legal risks, violating principles of transparency and good governance. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with active listening and information gathering to fully understand the client's situation and underlying needs. This should be followed by an objective analysis of the situation, considering all relevant factors, including potential risks, benefits, and regulatory implications. The next step involves exploring and evaluating various options, discussing these with the client, and collaboratively developing a recommended course of action. Finally, implementation and ongoing review ensure that the chosen path remains appropriate and effective. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that a critical system upgrade is behind schedule, and a key vendor has provided a proposed solution that addresses the immediate performance issue but lacks comprehensive documentation and has not undergone a full security review. The project manager is under pressure to meet the original deadline. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Implement the proposed solution, and then independently conduct a thorough security review and documentation update after the upgrade is live. Option B. Engage with the vendor to request immediate supplementary documentation and expedited security review, while also exploring interim mitigation strategies for the performance issue. Option C. Halt the upgrade process entirely until a fully documented and security-vetted solution can be developed, even if it means missing the deadline. Option D. Proceed with the vendor's proposed solution, assuming the vendor has internal controls, and address documentation and security later to meet the deadline. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the vendor's proposed solution, assuming the vendor has internal controls, and address documentation and security later to meet the deadline. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for a solution with the long-term implications of a decision, particularly when faced with incomplete information and potential conflicts of interest. The pressure to deliver a quick fix can lead to shortcuts that compromise ethical standards and regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing demands. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based decision-making process that aligns with regulatory expectations for due diligence and risk management. By seeking clarification, gathering all relevant information, and consulting with appropriate stakeholders, the professional demonstrates a commitment to acting in the best interest of the organization and its clients, adhering to principles of transparency and accountability. This aligns with the Oracle hiring assessment test's emphasis on ethical conduct and sound judgment within a defined regulatory framework. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding without full understanding or seeking external validation would represent a failure to exercise due diligence. This could lead to decisions that are not in the best interest of the organization, potentially violating internal policies or external regulations related to data handling, security, or client confidentiality. Another incorrect approach, such as making a decision based solely on personal bias or convenience, would be a direct contravention of ethical principles and could expose the organization to significant legal and reputational risks. The failure to document the decision-making process or to obtain necessary approvals would also be a significant regulatory and ethical lapse, hindering any future audit or review. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that includes clearly defining the problem, gathering all relevant facts and perspectives, identifying potential solutions, evaluating the risks and benefits of each solution against ethical and regulatory standards, consulting with relevant parties, making a reasoned decision, documenting the process, and implementing and monitoring the chosen solution. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are not only effective, but also compliant and ethically sound. Question 12. System analysis indicates that a critical new feature, essential for immediate business operations, has been developed. However, the standard impact assessment process, which evaluates potential effects on system stability, data integrity, security, and regulatory compliance, has not yet been completed due to time constraints. The development team is eager to deploy the feature to meet urgent business demands. Which of the following actions best upholds professional responsibility and regulatory adherence in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the deployment of the new feature immediately to meet business demands, with a commitment to conduct a retrospective impact assessment and address any issues that arise post-deployment. Option B. Deploy the feature with a focus solely on its functional requirements, assuming that any broader system impacts will be minor and can be managed reactively. Option C. Implement the feature with a verbal agreement from stakeholders to address any potential negative impacts as they become apparent, bypassing the formal impact assessment documentation. Option D. Delay the deployment of the new feature until a comprehensive impact assessment is completed, ensuring all potential risks and compliance implications are thoroughly understood and mitigated. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the deployment of the new feature immediately to meet business demands, with a commitment to conduct a retrospective impact assessment and address any issues that arise post-deployment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the immediate need for system functionality and the long-term implications of bypassing established impact assessment procedures. The pressure to deliver a critical feature quickly can lead to a temptation to cut corners, potentially exposing the organization to unforeseen risks. The challenge lies in balancing the urgency of business demands with the responsibility to ensure that changes are thoroughly evaluated for their potential impact on existing systems, data integrity, security, and compliance. This requires strong professional judgment and the ability to articulate the value of due diligence even under time constraints. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves conducting a comprehensive impact assessment, even if it requires a slight delay. This aligns with best professional practices mandated by regulatory frameworks that emphasize risk management and due diligence. For Oracle hiring assessment test, this would typically involve adhering to internal IT governance policies and potentially industry-standard frameworks that guide system change management. A thorough impact assessment ensures that all potential consequences of the proposed change are identified, analyzed, and mitigated before implementation. This proactive approach prevents costly errors, data breaches, security vulnerabilities, and non-compliance with regulations such as data privacy laws, e.g. GDPR if applicable to the exam's jurisdiction, or similar local data protection acts. It demonstrates a commitment to system stability, data security, and operational integrity, which are paramount in any regulated environment. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing the feature without a proper impact assessment represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It directly violates principles of responsible system development and deployment, which are often implicitly or explicitly covered in IT governance policies and compliance guidelines. This approach introduces unknown risks, potentially leading to system instability, data corruption, or security breaches. From a compliance perspective, it could result in violations of data protection regulations if sensitive data is mishandled or exposed. Prioritizing immediate delivery over a documented risk assessment, even with a verbal commitment to address issues later, is also professionally unacceptable. This bypasses the structured process designed to identify and manage risks systematically. It creates a precedent for neglecting due diligence and can lead to a reactive rather than proactive approach to system management, increasing the likelihood of critical failures and regulatory scrutiny. Focusing solely on the functional requirements without considering the broader system implications ignores the interconnected nature of IT systems. This narrow focus can lead to unintended consequences in other areas, such as performance degradation, integration issues, or security vulnerabilities that were not part of the initial functional scope. This oversight can result in significant operational disruptions and potential compliance breaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes risk management and adherence to established governance processes. When faced with pressure to expedite a change, the first step is to clearly articulate the purpose and value of the impact assessment process, referencing relevant internal policies or external best practices. If a delay is unavoidable, the professional should explore options for a phased assessment or a limited scope assessment that still addresses the most critical potential impacts. The decision to proceed without an assessment should only be made in extreme, documented emergencies, with a clear plan for immediate post-implementation review and remediation, and with appropriate stakeholder approval acknowledging the elevated risks. The core principle is to ensure that all changes are understood and their potential consequences managed, thereby safeguarding the integrity of the systems and the organization. Question 13. Research into the implementation of a new Oracle financial module has revealed a client's strong desire to bypass the standard impact assessment phase to expedite go-live. The client argues that the module's functionality is straightforward and that a formal assessment would cause unnecessary delays. What is the most appropriate course of action for the assessment candidate to recommend? Option A. Suggest a brief, informal discussion with key stakeholders to gauge potential impacts, as a full assessment may be overly burdensome. Option B. Agree to the client's request to skip the impact assessment, emphasizing that the client has accepted the associated risks. Option C. Propose a phased implementation where the impact assessment is conducted concurrently with the initial rollout of the module. Option D. Advise the client that a formal impact assessment is a mandatory step within the Oracle hiring assessment tests framework, and must be completed to identify potential risks and ensure compliance before proceeding with implementation. The correct answer is D. Advise the client that a formal impact assessment is a mandatory step within the Oracle Hiring Assessment Tests framework and must be completed to identify potential risks and ensure compliance before proceeding with implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for rapid deployment and the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough impact assessments before implementing significant changes to financial systems. The pressure to meet business objectives can lead to shortcuts that compromise compliance and risk management. Careful judgment is required to balance these competing demands. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the Oracle Hiring Assessment Tests regulatory framework, which mandates a structured and documented impact assessment process. This ensures that potential risks, including data integrity, system performance, and compliance with relevant financial regulations, as implicitly governed by the assessment's context, are identified and mitigated before implementation. This proactive stance aligns with principles of sound governance and risk management, preventing potential breaches and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that bypasses a formal impact assessment, even with client consent, fails to meet the implicit regulatory requirements of the assessment. This constitutes a significant ethical and regulatory failure. It demonstrates a disregard for due diligence and a willingness to accept unknown risks, which could lead to system failures, data corruption, or non-compliance with the assessment's underlying principles. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or informal discussions to gauge impact is equally flawed. This lacks the rigor and documentation necessary for a proper assessment, leaving the organization vulnerable to unforeseen consequences and unable to demonstrate compliance if audited. It also fails to provide a clear basis for decision-making, relying on subjective rather than objective evaluation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape and its implications for the task at hand. This involves identifying all mandatory steps, such as impact assessments, and their purpose. When faced with pressure to deviate, the professional should clearly articulate the regulatory requirements and the potential consequences of non-compliance to all stakeholders. The framework should then involve a risk-based evaluation, documenting any proposed deviations and their justifications, and seeking appropriate approvals if such deviations are deemed absolutely unavoidable and the risks are fully understood and accepted by senior management. Question 14. Stakeholder feedback indicates a potential oversight in the impact assessment for a new Oracle system deployment, specifically regarding the user experience for a niche department. This feedback is from a single department head who claims the current assessment doesn't fully capture the unique workflow challenges their team will face. What is the most appropriate next step to ensure the impact assessment remains robust and addresses potential issues effectively? Option A. Immediately halt the deployment and mandate a complete reevaluation of the entire impact assessment from scratch, involving all departments. Option B. Schedule a meeting with the department head to explain why their concerns are not valid based on the existing assessment's findings. Option C. Acknowledge the feedback but proceed with the deployment as planned, assuming the department head's concerns are isolated and not representative of broader issues. Option D. Initiate a targeted review of the impact assessment, specifically focusing on the workflow challenges of the affected department, cross-referencing their concerns with data from similar departments and the overall system design documentation. The correct answer is D. Initiate a targeted review of the impact assessment, specifically focusing on the workflow challenges of the affected department, cross-referencing their concerns with data from similar departments and the overall system design documentation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs and concerns of a specific stakeholder group with the broader, long-term implications of a system change. The core difficulty lies in discerning whether the feedback represents a genuine, critical flaw in the impact assessment or a localized, potentially manageable issue that doesn't necessitate a complete overhaul. Careful judgment is required to avoid overreacting to a single voice, while also ensuring that significant risks are not overlooked. Correct approach, which involves cross-referencing the feedback with other stakeholder groups and existing impact assessment data, represents best professional practice because it adheres to principles of comprehensive due diligence and objective analysis. This method ensures that decisions are informed by a wider range of perspectives and evidence, mitigating the risk of bias. It aligns with regulatory expectations for thoroughness and fairness in assessing the impact of changes, particularly in systems that affect multiple users or business functions. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to considering all relevant factors and stakeholders before making a significant decision. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the dissenting stakeholder's immediate request without further investigation fails to uphold professional responsibility. This could lead to inefficient resource allocation or the implementation of a suboptimal solution that doesn't address the root cause or consider wider implications. It risks violating ethical principles of fairness and objectivity by prioritizing one group's demands over a balanced assessment. Another incorrect approach, which dismisses the feedback outright without any form of validation or consideration, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for stakeholder input, which can lead to compliance issues if the feedback highlights a genuine risk or a violation of established procedures. Ethically, it shows a lack of respect for stakeholder concerns and can erode trust. A further incorrect approach, which involves immediately initiating a full-scale reevaluation of the entire impact assessment based on a single piece of feedback, is also professionally unsound. While thoroughness is important, this approach lacks proportionality and can lead to unnecessary delays and costs. It fails to apply critical thinking to assess the severity and scope of the issue raised by the feedback, potentially overreacting to a minor point. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, acknowledge and document the feedback. Second, assess the nature and potential impact of the feedback. Is it a minor inconvenience, a significant risk, or a fundamental flaw? Third, gather additional information by consulting other relevant stakeholders, reviewing existing documentation, and comparing the feedback against established criteria or previous assessments. Fourth, determine the appropriate course of action based on the gathered evidence, which could range from minor adjustments to a more comprehensive review. Finally, communicate the decision and the rationale clearly to all relevant parties. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that a client who has previously expressed a moderate risk tolerance and a goal of capital preservation is now requesting to invest a significant portion of their portfolio into a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that carries substantial risk of capital loss. The client insists on this course of action, citing a recent news article. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor in this situation? Option A. Inform the client that their request is unsuitable given their previously stated risk tolerance and goals, and refuse to execute the transaction, recommending only investments that the advisor deems appropriate. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, but make a note in the client's file that the instruction was given against the advisor's recommendation, without further discussion or explanation of risks. Option C. Immediately execute the client's requested investment to honor their explicit instruction, as the client has the ultimate authority over their assets. Option D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the source of their new conviction. Explain the risks associated with the requested investment in the context of their stated goals and risk tolerance, and present alternative strategies that might achieve their objectives with a more appropriate risk profile, documenting all advice and the client's final decision. The correct answer is D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the source of their new conviction. Explain the risks associated with the requested investment in the context of their stated goals and risk tolerance, and present alternative strategies that might achieve their objectives with a more appropriate risk profile, documenting all advice and the client's final decision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the potential conflict between a client's stated preferences and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when those preferences might lead to suboptimal outcomes or increased risk. The advisor must navigate the delicate balance of respecting client autonomy while upholding their professional obligations under the Oracle Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework. The challenge lies in identifying when a client's instruction, if followed blindly, could breach regulatory requirements or ethical standards, necessitating a more proactive and advisory approach. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their preference. This aligns with the principles of client-centric advice and the regulatory expectation that financial professionals ensure suitability and appropriateness of recommendations. By explaining the potential risks and alternative strategies that better align with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, the advisor fulfills their duty of care and fiduciary responsibility. This proactive engagement, coupled with clear documentation of the advice given and the client's final decision, demonstrates adherence to regulatory guidelines that emphasize informed consent and suitability. It prioritizes the client's long-term financial well-being over immediate, potentially detrimental, instructions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately executing the client's instruction without further inquiry. This fails to meet the regulatory standard of ensuring suitability and acting in the client's best interest. It could lead to a breach of fiduciary duty if the instruction results in an unsuitable investment or an unacceptable level of risk for the client, potentially exposing the firm to regulatory sanctions and client litigation. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's preference outright and impose the advisor's own recommendation, without adequate explanation or consideration of the client's perspective. This disregards client autonomy and can damage the client relationship. While the advisor has a duty to advise, a paternalistic approach that ignores client input is not in line with best practices and could be seen as a failure to engage in a collaborative advisory process, potentially leading to client dissatisfaction and complaints. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's instruction, but fail to document the discussion or the rationale behind the decision. This creates a significant compliance risk. In the event of a client complaint or regulatory review, the absence of documentation makes it impossible to demonstrate that due diligence was performed or that the client was fully informed of the risks. This lack of transparency and accountability is a direct violation of regulatory expectations for record keeping and client communication. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's objectives and risk tolerance. When a client's instruction appears to conflict with these, the professional should engage in a transparent dialogue, clearly articulating the potential consequences and exploring alternatives. This process should be guided by the firm's compliance policies and the overarching regulatory framework, ensuring that all advice and actions are documented. The ultimate decision rests with the client, but the professional's role is to ensure that decision is informed and aligned with their best interests, as defined by regulatory and ethical standards. Question 16. Which approach would be most appropriate for a financial advisor when a client expresses a strong desire to invest in a specific complex financial product that the advisor believes may not align with the client's stated risk tolerance and long-term financial objectives? Option A. Inform the client that the requested product is too risky and refuse to execute the transaction without offering further explanation or alternatives. Option B. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, and then explain to the client why the requested product may not be suitable, offering alternative recommendations that better align with their profile. Option C. Recommend a different, simpler product without fully explaining the rationale, assuming the client will appreciate the advisor's attempt to simplify their portfolio. Option D. Proceed with the client's requested investment immediately, as the client's explicit instruction takes precedence over any advisor concerns. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, and then explain to the client why the requested product may not be suitable, offering alternative recommendations that better align with their profile. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated desire for a specific investment product and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when that product may not align with the client's risk tolerance or financial goals. The advisor must navigate the client's potential lack of full understanding of the product's implications and the regulatory imperative to provide suitable advice. Careful judgment is required to balance client autonomy with regulatory compliance and ethical responsibility. The correct approach represents best professional practice, because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance before recommending any product. This aligns with the core principles of client-centric advice and the regulatory framework governing financial advisory services, which mandate suitability and fiduciary responsibility. By conducting a comprehensive assessment, the advisor ensures that any recommendation is genuinely in the client's best interest, not merely fulfilling a stated preference that might be ill-informed. This proactive due diligence is a cornerstone of ethical financial advising and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's stated product preference without adequate due diligence fails to uphold the fiduciary duty. This can lead to regulatory breaches related to suitability requirements, as the advisor has not confirmed that the product is appropriate for the client's specific circumstances. Ethically, it represents a failure to act in the client's best interest, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or suboptimal financial outcomes. Another incorrect approach that involves pressuring the client to accept a different product without fully exploring the reasons behind their initial preference, or without clearly explaining the benefits of alternatives in relation to their stated goals, also constitutes a regulatory and ethical failure. This can be perceived as a lack of respect for client autonomy and may not adequately address the client's underlying needs or concerns. It risks alienating the client and failing to build trust, which is essential for a long-term professional relationship. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the client's stated request and underlying motivations. 2. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge. 3. Evaluate the suitability of the requested product against this assessment. 4. If the product is not suitable, clearly and transparently explain the reasons to the client, referencing their stated goals and risk tolerance. 5. Propose alternative solutions that are demonstrably more suitable and explain their benefits in relation to the client's objectives. 6. Document all discussions, assessments, and recommendations thoroughly. 7. Respect the client's final decision, provided it is an informed one, while ensuring all regulatory obligations have been met. Question 17. The review process indicates that a client has approached their tax advisor with a proposal for a highly aggressive tax planning strategy designed to significantly reduce their current tax liability. The advisor has a preliminary understanding of the strategy, which appears to exploit a technical loophole in a recent piece of tax legislation. The client is eager to proceed, emphasizing the potential savings. The advisor is aware that while the strategy might technically adhere to the literal wording of the legislation, it could be viewed by the relevant tax authority as artificial or lacking commercial substance, potentially attracting scrutiny under general anti-avoidance rules. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible course of action for the tax advisor? Option A. Proceed with the aggressive tax planning strategy, but only after obtaining a written indemnity from the client against any penalties or interest that may arise if the strategy is successfully challenged by the tax authority. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's financial situation, the specific details of the proposed transaction, and all relevant tax legislation, guidance, and professional pronouncements to determine the legality, commercial substance, and potential risks of the strategy before advising the client. Option C. Refuse to consider any form of tax planning, including legitimate strategies, and advise the client to simply pay their taxes as assessed without exploring any potential reliefs or allowances. Option D. Immediately implement the aggressive tax planning strategy as proposed by the client, as the client is insistent and the advisor believes it might technically comply with the letter of the law. The correct answer is D. Immediately implement the aggressive tax planning strategy as proposed by the client, as the client is insistent and the advisor believes it might technically comply with the letter of the law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for aggressive tax planning and the advisor's obligation to adhere to regulatory frameworks and ethical standards. The advisor must navigate the fine line between providing legitimate tax advice and facilitating potentially non-compliant or aggressive schemes. The challenge lies in interpreting the spirit of the law, not just its letter, and recognizing when a proposed strategy crosses into territory that could attract scrutiny from tax authorities or violate professional conduct rules. Careful judgment is required to balance client service with professional integrity and legal compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation and the applicable tax laws before offering any advice. This involves a detailed review of the client's existing tax returns, financial statements, and the specific details of the proposed transaction. It also necessitates consulting relevant tax legislation, guidance from tax authorities e.g. HMRC in the UK, and professional body pronouncements e.g. SISI Code of Conduct. This proactive and diligent approach ensures that any advice given is compliant, ethical, and tailored to the client's actual circumstances, thereby mitigating risks for both the client and the advisor. It aligns with the principle of providing competent and diligent advice, acting in the client's best interest while upholding professional standards. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately recommending the aggressive tax planning strategy without sufficient due diligence. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it demonstrates a lack of professional competence and diligence. It bypasses the crucial step of verifying the legality and appropriateness of the strategy, potentially exposing the client to significant penalties, interest, and reputational damage if the scheme is challenged by tax authorities. It also violates the ethical duty to act with integrity and in the client's best interest, as it prioritizes a potentially risky solution over a prudent one. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without any investigation or explanation. Caution is necessary. A complete refusal without understanding the client's objectives or exploring legitimate tax planning opportunities can be seen as a failure to provide adequate service. It may not align with the professional duty to advise clients on their tax obligations and opportunities within the bounds of the law. Ethically, it could be perceived as unhelpful and lacking in client engagement, potentially damaging the professional relationship. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the aggressive strategy based solely on the client's insistence and the advisor's belief that it might technically comply with the letter of the law, ignoring potential anti-avoidance provisions or the general anti-abuse rules. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Tax legislation often includes provisions designed to counteract artificial or contrived arrangements intended to obtain a tax advantage. Relying solely on a narrow interpretation of the law without considering the underlying intent or potential for challenge by tax authorities is a dereliction of professional duty. It exposes the client to substantial risk and the advisor to potential disciplinary action, fines, or loss of professional standing for facilitating tax evasion or aggressive avoidance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with client requests for aggressive tax planning. This process should begin with a comprehensive understanding of the client's objectives and financial situation. Next, a thorough review of all relevant tax legislation, case law, and official guidance is essential. The advisor must then critically assess the proposed strategy against these legal and regulatory frameworks, considering both the letter and the spirit of the law, as well as any anti-avoidance provisions. If the strategy appears questionable or carries significant risk, the advisor should clearly communicate these risks to the client, explaining the potential consequences. If the strategy remains non-compliant or ethically dubious, the advisor must refuse to implement it and explain the refusal based on legal and ethical grounds. Maintaining open communication, documenting all advice and decisions, and seeking specialist advice when necessary are crucial components of this process. Question 18. The analysis reveals that a client seeking to invest a significant sum expresses a strong preference for a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that carries substantial risk and is not typically recommended for their stated investment objectives and risk tolerance profile. The advisor has identified several alternative investments that are more suitable, diversified, and align better with the client's long-term financial goals, while also complying with all relevant regulatory guidelines for client suitability. The challenge lies in how to proceed while adhering strictly to the Oracle Hiring Assessment Test's implied regulatory framework, which emphasizes client protection and fiduciary responsibility. Option A. Advise the client that their preferred investment is unsuitable due to regulatory guidelines and fiduciary duties. Explain the risks clearly, and present the suitable alternative investments that meet their objectives. Option B. Inform the client that their preference cannot be accommodated due to regulatory restrictions, and suggest they seek advice elsewhere if they insist on this specific investment. Option C. Gently steer the client towards their preferred investment by downplaying the associated risks and highlighting only the potential upside to maintain client satisfaction. Option D. Proceed with the client's preferred investment, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks and has the ultimate authority to decide, without further detailed explanation of alternatives. The correct answer is A. Advise the client that their preferred investment is unsuitable due to regulatory guidelines and fiduciary duties. Explain the risks clearly, and present the suitable alternative investments that meet their objectives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when that preference might lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory noncompliance. The advisor must navigate this by prioritizing regulatory obligations and ethical principles over immediate client satisfaction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty, which is a cornerstone of regulatory frameworks governing financial advice. This duty mandates that the advisor must act with the utmost good faith and in the client's best interest, even if it means disagreeing with or educating the client on the risks of their preferred course of action. This aligns with the principles of suitability and client protection embedded in regulations designed to prevent harm and ensure informed decision-making. An incorrect approach that prioritizes the client's stated preference without adequate due diligence or explanation fails to meet the regulatory standard of care. This could lead to a breach of fiduciary duty, as the advisor would be facilitating a potentially unsuitable or detrimental investment. Another incorrect approach, which involves unilaterally dismissing the client's preference without attempting to understand the underlying reasons or provide alternative, suitable recommendations, demonstrates a lack of client engagement and could be perceived as paternalistic or dismissive, potentially damaging the professional relationship and failing to explore all avenues for achieving the client's goals within regulatory boundaries. A third incorrect approach, which involves misrepresenting the risks or benefits to align with the client's preference, constitutes a severe ethical and regulatory violation, potentially leading to mis-selling and significant client harm, with severe repercussions for the advisor and their firm. The professional reasoning process should involve active listening to understand the client's motivations, clearly explaining the regulatory requirements and the advisor's fiduciary obligations, presenting suitable alternatives that align with the client's objectives while adhering to regulations, and documenting all discussions and decisions thoroughly. The advisor must be prepared to educate the client on the implications of their choices and the rationale behind the recommended course of action. Question 19. Compliance review shows that a long-standing corporate client has proposed a series of complex cross-border transactions designed to significantly reduce their global tax liability. The client's internal tax department has provided documentation asserting the legality of these arrangements, but the proposed structures appear to involve novel interpretations of tax law and a lack of clear commercial substance beyond tax benefits. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm? Option A. Proceed with the transactions as proposed by the client, relying on their assurance that the arrangements are legal and have been vetted by their internal tax department. Option B. Conduct an in-depth review of the economic substance and commercial rationale of the proposed transactions, consult with internal tax specialists and legal counsel, and request further clarification and supporting documentation from the client before proceeding. Option C. Focus solely on the technical tax compliance aspects of the proposed transactions, ensuring all reporting requirements are met, and deferring judgment on the underlying commercial rationale. Option D. Advise the client that the firm cannot assist with these transactions due to the perceived aggressive nature and lack of clear commercial substance, without further investigation. The correct answer is B. Conduct an in-depth review of the economic substance and commercial rationale of the proposed transactions, consult with internal tax specialists and legal counsel, and request further clarification and supporting documentation from the client before proceeding. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for aggressive tax planning and the firm's ethical and regulatory obligations. The challenge lies in navigating the fine line between legitimate tax avoidance strategies and potentially abusive tax evasion schemes, especially when the client is a sophisticated entity with a history of complex financial arrangements. The firm must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance while maintaining a strong client relationship. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, multi-layered review process that prioritizes understanding the economic substance of the proposed transaction. This includes scrutinizing the documentation for clarity and completeness, assessing the commercial rationale beyond tax benefits, and consulting with internal tax specialists and potentially external legal counsel. This approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental ethical duty of professional competence and due care, as well as regulatory requirements that mandate a robust understanding of client activities and the prevention of financial crime. Specifically, under the Oracle hiring assessment test's implied regulatory framework, which would typically align with general principles of professional conduct and financial regulation. This thoroughness ensures the firm is not facilitating illegal or unethical activities. It demonstrates a commitment to upholding the integrity of the financial system and the firm's reputation. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that solely relies on the client's assurance of legality without independent verification fails to meet the standard of professional skepticism and due diligence. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it abdicates the firm's responsibility to conduct its own assessment, potentially leading to the facilitation of illicit activities, breaches the duty of care owed to the public and the regulatory bodies overseeing financial services. An approach that focuses only on the technical tax implications without considering the broader commercial and ethical context is also problematic. While technical accuracy is important, it does not absolve the firm from assessing the overall legitimacy and potential for abuse of a transaction. This can lead to a narrow, myopic view that overlooks red flags, constituting an ethical lapse in professional judgment and a potential regulatory breach if it results in the facilitation of non-compliant behavior. An approach that prioritizes client satisfaction and revenue generation above all else, leading to a rushed or superficial review, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a disregard for professional standards and a potential willingness to compromise integrity for financial gain. Such an approach can expose the firm to severe penalties, reputational damage, and legal repercussions for aiding and abetting non-compliant activities. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that begins with understanding the client's objectives and the proposed transaction. This should be followed by a rigorous assessment of the economic substance, commercial rationale, and potential tax implications, always with a healthy dose of professional skepticism. When in doubt, seeking advice from senior colleagues, internal specialists, or external experts is crucial. The decision-making process should be documented thoroughly, demonstrating the steps taken to ensure compliance and ethical conduct. The ultimate decision must be based on whether the proposed activity aligns with regulatory requirements, ethical principles, and the firm's risk appetite, rather than solely on client demands or potential profitability. Question 20. The performance metrics show a significant increase in client acquisition over the last quarter, but also a concerning rise in client churn within the same period. How should these metrics be presented to senior management to ensure a balanced and accurate understanding of the business's health? Option A. Present both the increase in client acquisition and the rise in client churn, providing context for each and discussing potential contributing factors and mitigation strategies for the churn. Option B. Attribute the client acquisition success solely to the new marketing campaign and the client churn solely to external market forces, without further analysis. Option C. Highlight only the increase in client acquisition, as this is a positive indicator of growth and will likely be well received by senior management. Option D. Focus on the rise in client churn, emphasizing the negative impact on profitability and suggesting immediate, drastic cost-cutting measures. The correct answer is A. Present both the increase in client acquisition and the rise in client churn, providing context for each and discussing potential contributing factors and mitigation strategies for the churn. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for accurate performance reporting with the potential for misinterpretation or misuse of data. The core of the challenge lies in presenting complex performance metrics in a way that is both informative and ethically sound, avoiding any implication of manipulation or misleading conclusions. Careful judgment is required to ensure transparency and prevent the metrics from being used to justify actions that are not supported by the underlying data or regulatory requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a nuanced and contextualized presentation of performance metrics. By highlighting both positive and negative trends and explicitly stating the limitations of the data, it upholds the principles of accuracy, fairness, and transparency. This aligns with regulatory expectations that financial professionals provide clear, unbiased information to stakeholders, preventing misrepresentation and ensuring informed decision-making. It demonstrates a commitment to professional integrity by acknowledging the complexities of performance analysis rather than oversimplifying them. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on positive metrics fails to provide a complete picture and can be considered misleading. This violates the ethical duty to present information truthfully and accurately, potentially leading stakeholders to make decisions based on incomplete or biased data. Such an approach could also contravene regulatory guidelines that mandate comprehensive disclosure. Another incorrect approach that attributes performance solely to individual effort without considering external factors or systemic influences is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to unfair assessments, demotivation, and a failure to identify broader issues that may be impacting performance. Ethically, it is important to acknowledge the interplay of various factors influencing outcomes, and regulators often expect a holistic view of performance. A third incorrect approach that uses metrics to justify predetermined conclusions, regardless of the data's actual implications, represents a significant ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of objectivity and a disregard for the integrity of the performance analysis process. It can lead to decisions that are not data-driven and may have negative consequences for the organization and its stakeholders, potentially violating regulations that require decisions to be based on sound analysis. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the data, its limitation, and the intended audience. Professionals should always strive for clarity, accuracy, and completeness in their reporting. They must consider the potential for misinterpretation and proactively address any ambiguities. A critical step is to contextualize the metrics, explaining the factors that may have influenced them and avoiding definitive pronouncements where the data is not conclusive. Adherence to ethical codes and regulatory frameworks should guide every aspect of performance analysis and reporting.